Hello everyone, welcome to the Case Crack Stories. I am Jason, a dismemberment killer, consumed by his own twisted fantasies. He extended his predatory reach toward his own family, while he was greedily indulging his desires. He never expected a petite female victim to escape with her life, eventually sending him to the execution chamber. This is the true story of the Mississippi Butcher and the Girl in the Box case. In the early hours of August 13, 1996, in a small town in southern Mississippi, on a street in Moss Point that was always peaceful and quiet, there was a sudden, urgent, almost hysterical pounding on a door. When the bleary-eyed homeowner opened the door, he was shocked to see a petite blonde woman holding a meat cleaver in her hand, her entire body shaking uncontrollably, begging the homeowner to let her in to hide. Seeing the terror in her eyes, the homeowner did not hesitate. He immediately let her into the house. Then he closed and locked the door. While reaching for his own firearm, he dialed 911. After the police arrived, the woman was still visibly shaken. She kept repeating, "They shot him." Then she pointed toward a house across the street. Realizing the situation involved a shooting and potential fatalities, the officers took no chances. They immediately called for backup. Then they conducted a search of the house. Initially, everything appeared normal. The rooms were cleaned and orderly. No bloodstains or signs of a struggle were found, except for a massive wooden box sitting in a corner of the house. It looked like any other ordinary residence. But when the officers left the building and entered the backyard, they immediately noticed something was wrong. The smell of blood hung in the air, and among a pile of debris scattered on the ground, they discovered an axe covered in blood and hair. But as they scanned the area, no body was in sight. Only on the bow of a small boat, they discovered several droplets of blood. The backyard of this house sat directly against a small creek that fed into the swamp. Consequently, police suspected that the victim's remains might have been discarded in the waterway. Early the following morning, not long after the police search team began heading downstream, they discovered a large quantity of flesh floating on the surface of the water. To prevent this potential forensic evidence from being consumed by the alligators that frequently patrolled these waters, search team members immediately used tools and their bare hands to begin the recovery. The medical examiner later confirmed that the 80+ pieces of flesh they recovered were all human remains. So who was the deceased? What had happened inside that house? And what was the purpose of that crate? The hope of solving these mysteries now rested entirely on the blonde girl. Fortunately, after being taken into protective custody at the station, her mental state improved significantly. She began recounting her ordeal to the police. The girl's name was Brooke, 18 years old, from Houston, Texas. She had met and fallen in love with her boyfriend, Jeffrey. Only weeks prior, they had become inseparable. In August 1996, her boyfriend, Jeffrey, suggested that he needed to go to Mississippi to collect a debt from a friend. Brooke could come along after the matter was settled. They could spend some time traveling around the area. Brooke readily accepted the proposal. She packed a few clothes and set off happily with her boyfriend. After an enjoyable trip, they arrived at their destination on the night of the 12th. It was that residential house. Once the car was parked, Brooke felt something was off. Her boyfriend had said the contact was waiting for them, but the front porch lights were turned off. It wasn't until she stepped out of the car that she saw a tall man sitting in the darkness, smoking. Upon seeing Brooke, the man kept his eyes fixed on her. However, when she saw her boyfriend and the man greet each other warmly, and the man hospitably invited them inside, Brooke's suspicions faded. Through her boyfriend's introduction, Brooke learned the man's identity. The other man was identified as Gary. After entering the house, Brooke sat on the sofa watching television. Her boyfriend followed Gary into the kitchen to discuss business. Both men appeared friendly. The atmosphere of the conversation seemed harmonious. Brooke paid no particular attention to what they were discussing. Her focus was gradually drawn to the program on the screen. She had no way of knowing that, only a few minutes later, 2 gunshots would ring out from the kitchen. The shock jolted Brooke's entire body. She looked up. In the kitchen, another man had appeared out of nowhere. He held a handgun that was still smoking. Her boyfriend, Jeffrey, had collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest. He was struggling violently, trying to stand back up, but the newly arrived man gave him no opportunity. He stepped forward, pressing the muzzle almost directly against Jeffrey's body. He fired 7 more rounds in rapid succession until Jeffrey no longer made a sound. Having witnessed the entire execution of her boyfriend, Brooke was paralyzed on the sofa with terror. She was unable to move. It wasn't until the 2 men began walking toward her that she thought to get up and run, but it was already too late. She was immediately tackled to the floor by Gary, the man who had first welcomed them into the house. Her hands were wrenched behind her back and bound. She was then gagged. At that moment, Brooke was consumed by despair. Her life had only just begun. Was she really going to die here for no reason? However, the two men did not kill her immediately. Instead, they carried her into the bedroom and locked her inside a massive, old, wooden chest. An unknown amount of time passed in a state of terror. The chest was opened again. Gary dragged Brooke out. By this time, the house had clearly been cleaned. Jeffrey's body and the man who had suddenly appeared were both gone. Only Gary remained. His expression twisted. He told Brooke viciously that whether she lived or died depended on her ability to satisfy him. With that, he lunged at Brooke and committed the sexual assault. After he finished venting his depraved impulses, Gary bound Brooke's hands and feet once again. He shoved her back into the wooden crate. Then he locked it. In the total darkness, Brooke began to violently twist her limbs. She finally managed to slip her hands and feet out of the ropes. Next, she attempted to open the crate, but the lid above her head was locked. It wouldn't budge. She was also afraid that making too much noise would draw Gary back, and she might be murdered. She could only wait for an opportunity. A short while later, exhausted by the physical pain and the sheer terror, Brooke drifted into a deep sleep. Until the early hours of August 13th, Brooke was jolted awake from a nightmare by the sound of a telephone. It was the landline in the room. It rang for a long time without being answered. This meant one thing. There was no one in the house. This was the chance she had been waiting for, because the crate was relatively spacious. Brooke adjusted her body into a crawling position on all fours. Then, using her hands and feet for leverage, she slammed her back against the lid. Fate finally shifted in her favor. The lock on the vintage crate loosened and fell off under Brooke's repeated impacts. She crawled out. Once free, Brooke took no chances. She first rushed into the nearest kitchen, grabbed a meat cleaver and gripped it tight. Then she pushed open the front door and ran out. As soon as she stepped outside, Brooke saw headlights fast approaching in the distance. She quickly dove into a low thicket of bushes to hide. She watched as the car pulled up in front of the house. Gary got out. Brooke's heart was racing. She wasn't sure if Gary's headlights had caught her. What would she do if he suddenly charged at her? Fortunately, the man didn't seem to notice her. Instead, he walked straight into the house. Moments later, Gary rushed back out, looking visibly panicked. He didn't search the perimeter. Instead, he jumped back into the car. He floored the accelerator and sped away. Brooke felt a brief moment of relief but didn't dare waste a second. She immediately bolted toward the nearest neighbor's house. She pounded on the door to report the crime. After hearing Brooke's account of the events, the police immediately issued a warrant for the homeowner, Gary. But what was the motive behind Gary's atrocities? Who was the other man who suddenly appeared in the house and shot Jeffrey dead? And that phone call that rang in the middle of the night, indirectly aiding in Brooke's rescue, who was on the other end? To answer these questions, we have to shift our focus to another woman named Lori. She was Gary's wife. 6 years ago, Lori had just come out of a failed marriage. She was living alone, raising 2 children. Gary was the gardener at her children's preschool. One day, while she was picking up the kids, the two of them met. This man, smelling of earth and sunshine, was incredibly kind to the children. He quickly won Lori's heart. 6 months later, they were married. During this period, Lori also learned that Gary wasn't just a laborer who spent his time with plants. He was also a relentless amateur writer. His hobby during his downtime at work was drafting short stories. Over the years, his office had become filled with over 50 folders containing his manuscripts. However, whenever Lori asked what kind of stories Gary was writing, he would only offer a mysterious smile. He said he'd wait until the day his book was published before letting Lori read them. Until then, he made her promise not to look at them on her own. Despite saying that, Gary seemed to bring it up frequently, as if intentionally piquing Lori's curiosity. Finally, one day, Lori's curiosity got the better of her, and she opened the folders. What she read left her speechless and horrified. Almost every story shared a common theme: sadistic fantasies about women being imprisoned, bound, and abused. Some of the details reached a level of depravity that was physically sickening. Regarding this, Gary's defense was simple. He claimed those were merely fictional plots written out of thin air to cater to the tastes of a specific readership. He insisted he was absolutely not that kind of deviant. Looking at her husband's earnest demeanor and considering his behavior in their daily lives, Lori chose to believe him. She stopped fixating on the matter, but subsequent events would prove that the sunny, friendly, and upright persona was nothing more than a facade Gary had painstakingly constructed to conceal his twisted inner desires. His true dark side was exposed shortly thereafter. It happened after Lori became pregnant again and gave birth to her and Gary's first daughter. While Lori was still in a weakened state, recovering from childbirth, Gary grew impatient for sexual intimacy. When Lori explicitly refused, stating she was physically unwell, the demon wearing the smiling mask showed his true face for the first time. He pinned Lori down by force and gratified his animalistic urges. Because it was the early 1990s, and they were in Mississippi, a state with the most conservative American values, the concept of spousal rape was virtually unheard of. So, although Lori felt immense grief and humiliation afterward, she had no means of seeking justice. She had no choice but to settle and continue with her life. From that day forward, Gary began to display his forbidden desires without any pretense. One day, while Lori was cooking, she heard a commotion. When she went to investigate, she found Gary moving a massive, old wooden crate into the room. Lori remembered that among the deviant fantasies Gary had written down, there was a story about imprisoning a woman in a wooden box and subjecting her to various tortures. Looking at that pitch-black crate, her skin crawled. When she pleaded with Gary not to keep such an ominous object in the house, Gary didn't say a word. He just stared straight at Lori. Then, he suddenly lunged. His hands clamped firmly around Lori's neck. He throttled her until she lost consciousness. When she woke up, Lori found herself bound to her own bed, unable to move. Ignoring Lori's desperate pleas, Gary first proceeded to blindfold his wife. He then produced a sharp knife. He slowly ran the blade across Lori's face and body. He carefully controlled his strength. He ensured that Lori felt the full sensation. The coldness and the sharpness of the blade were felt. He refrained from actually cutting her skin. Lori wanted to scream and struggle in terror, but a thought suddenly occurred to her. In one of Gary's stories, the more the female victim screamed for mercy, the more the abuser was stimulated. Although she was trembling with fear, she gritted her teeth and remained silent. This continued for an unknown duration. Gary eventually untied the ropes. "You're boring," he said with boredom. "No fun at all." Then he left. Lori no longer felt safe in the house. There was no telling which perverse fantasy Gary would try next. She didn't know what he was planning for her. Lori immediately took the opportunity to flee the house. She went to the police station to file a report, but the same problem remained. At that time, the police had little vigilance or interest in so-called domestic matters. They lacked concern for such cases. Regarding Lori's allegations of rape and abuse, they stated that, without hard evidence, relying solely on Lori's verbal testimony, they were unable to take any official action. With no other options, Lori settled for a secondary goal. She chose to file for divorce from Gary. She was blocked again at this stage. After calling a legal aid hotline and expressing her intent to divorce due to domestic abuse, the person on the other end responded. They told her to go to the hospital for a pregnancy test first, because in the state of Mississippi, divorce is prohibited during pregnancy. The test results drove Lori back into despair. She was indeed pregnant. Fortunately, in the end, with the assistance of a domestic violence advocacy group, she took her 3 children and her unborn baby and moved into a separate apartment. Although she was unemployed and had no money to her name, life had to be rebuilt from nothing but being far away from her predatory husband. Lori finally felt a sense of security. Through her own hard work, this modest apartment was gradually becoming a home. It became a sanctuary for Lori and her 4 children. In early 1996, Lori's younger brother, Tim, relocated for work. He moved into the apartment to live with the family. Tim got along well with the children. He assisted with the household chores and helped with the school runs. It made Lori feel that the worst was finally behind them. But on the night of August 12, 1996, the nightmare returned. That evening, after hearing a knock at the door, Lori looked through the peephole. Her husband, Gary, was standing right there. Terrified, she backed away immediately. Then her brother, Tim, opened the door and walked out. He began speaking with Gary in a friendly manner. This infuriated Lori. She had no idea that her brother was still on good terms with the man who had caused her so much trauma. When Tim returned inside, she confronted him immediately. Tim appeared nervous and told her, "It's complicated. I'll explain everything later. I have to go out now. To do Gary a favor, I'll be back soon." He left in a hurry. Concerned for her brother's safety, Lori waited up after putting the children to bed. She kept watch, but as the early morning hours passed, Tim never returned home. Had she been able to see what was happening? Back at the house she once shared with Gary, she would have witnessed the brutal scene described at the start of this case. Gary and Brooke's boyfriend, Jeffrey, were in the kitchen pretending to discuss business. While Jeffrey's guard was down, Tim emerged from the shadows. He fired 9 shots, killing Jeffrey. He then assisted Gary in tackling Brooke to the ground. They bound her and forced her into a wooden crate. Lori remained completely unaware of the unfolding situation. She waited at home until past 3 a.m. Her brother still had not returned. She eventually summoned the courage. She dialed the number to her former residence. She intended to ask for an update. What she didn't know at the time was that the sound of the phone ringing woke Brooke from her stupor inside the wooden crate. It helped her confirm that the house was empty, allowing her to eventually break out of the box and escape to safety. It can only be described this way. All of these coincidences seemed as if they were driven by some unseen hand of fate. Not long after she made that unanswered call, her brother, Tim, returned. His eyes were vacant. When confronted by his sister, he spoke with deep remorse. He claimed Gary had threatened the safety of Lori and her children. That was the only reason he agreed to help. He never imagined he would commit such an irrevocable crime. On the following morning, Tim went to the police station and turned himself in. A day later, Lori received a videotape. Gary had recorded it while on the run. He filmed it at a store selling video equipment. Addressing the camera, he expressed his apologies to Lori. He stated he would face all consequences. A few hours later, Gary surrendered to the police. Once in custody, Gary confessed to all the crimes. He admitted to being the mastermind behind the entire operation. He had recruited Tim as the gunman. Tim's primary role was to pull the trigger on Jeffrey. The subsequent dismemberment and disposal of the body, as well as the imprisonment and sexual assault of Brooke, were all his own doing. In 1997, the trial for Gary and Tim commenced. Brooke stood in court as a key witness. She recounted her ordeal. Ultimately, for the shooting of Jeffrey and his involvement in Brooke's kidnapping, Tim was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The mastermind, Gary, was sentenced to death. The execution was carried out on June 20, 2012. His 50-year life was terminated via lethal injection. But for Brooke, the nightmare was far from over. The severe psychological trauma triggered a terrifying delusion. She was convinced that Gary's wife Lori and their children must harbor a deep hatred for her. In her mind, she had caused their father's death and ensured their uncle would spend the rest of his life behind bars. She believed they would find a way to retaliate or even kill her. Consequently, over the next 2 decades, she cut off her long blonde hair and dyed it dark. She constantly changed her profession and her place of residence. Most of the best years of her life were wasted in a state of anxiety and fear fueled by these inner demons. It wasn't until 2023, 27 years after the crime, that a documentary film crew facilitated a meeting. Lori and Brooke, 2 women who had both been severely victimized by Gary, met for the very first time. Lori expressed her sincere gratitude. She told Brooke that it was only because she contacted the police that she and her children were finally able to escape Gary's shadow of terror. Brooke also learned the truth. The mysterious phone call that saved her life had come from Lori. Her inner demons finally dissolved in tears of emotion and relief. That concludes today's program. Once again, thank you very much for your support and encouragement. I will see you in the next video.